So hello everyone, welcome to those who are following us online and those of you who came here. My name is Bernardo Jurema. I'm a research associate at the project Democratic Governance for Ecopolitical Transformation and also at the focal topic, Justice and Sustainability, here at the Research Institute for Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. This is the third lecture this year in the Justice and Sustainability series that we are organizing as part of the activities of the RIFS focal topic. Today's lecture is also part of the worldwide teaching on climate and justice, which is taking place this week and involving many communities around the world. And so we welcome all of you who are joining us through the teaching platform. Today we're going to talk about Lützerath, what it was, what is its meaning and its implications. And in order to do that, we have three guests with us today. Here with us in person at the Institute, we have Ruairí. He's a Berlin-based journalist who reports on climate, housing, and politics, and has written for different outlets like Foreign Policy, Vice, LA Times, Al Jazeera English, and the London Review of Books, where he published, in my opinion, the best piece that I read, anyways, about Lützerath that you can find there on the website. I really recommend it. And we have also joining us remotely because of healthy issues. She was going to be here, but unfortunately had to be stuck at home. Judith Pape is a junior fellow here at the RIFS and also a freelancing social scientist, a facilitator, and campaigner at the intersection of democracy and climate justice activism. And joining us directly from Taiwan is Elias König. He's an affiliate scholar with the Research Institute for Sustainability and writes about social movements, climate and climate justice. And he's the author of the book Klimagerechtigkeit, warum wir eine sozial-ökologische Revolution brauchen, that came out 2 years ago. So welcome everyone. Thank you, our three guests today. So to begin, I propose that we begin with Ruairí, and so that we can have like to provide us a context where what is Lützerath, what happened there, why did it become what it did, what is the history, who benefits from it. Anyways, yeah, what do you think it's important that we know about Lützerath, and also taking in account that maybe some of the people who are watching us are not totally familiar, or maybe even are not are at all not familiar with Lützerath. So it would be good to have this context before we dive in.
Sure. So Lützerath is or was a small village about an hour west of Cologne in Western Germany. And it sits in the kind of historical lignite mining region. And it had about, I think, around 100 people at its peak population, but the mine, the Garzweiler or Garzweiler 2 mine, which is adjacent to it, has been steadily expanding over the years. And so Lützerath, like a lot of dozens of other towns before it, was largely depopulated, with people being moved away. So the buildings could be destroyed, the trees ripped up, and then the mine expanded to increase production. There was one remaining, up until last year, there was one remaining resident, Eckhard Heukamp, who was a farmer, and he was opposing the buyout of his land by RWE, which is the large energy multinational that's based there and that runs the power plant and the mine. And until March last year, he fought that in the courts, but eventually lost. But basically, during that fight, he had invited a lot of climate activists to his farm to help him resist eviction and to highlight the ecological damage that the mine was doing. So I first visited Lützerath in September 2021, just before the last federal elections. And back then there were a couple of dozen climate activists who were like building structures and using a house that White Camp had given them. And basically up until January of this year, the amount of people activists went there to resist grew and grew, and the eventually became quite a little fortress kind of in what remained of the town. A lot of tree houses and barricades and so on. And the final eviction happened in, I think, the second week of January. So that was when I think one of the biggest police operations in recent German history, hundreds and hundreds of officers and hundreds of security staff from the energy company Ruairí worked together to, over the course of about a week, evict all of the climate activists. And now I think what remains of the village is scheduled for destruction in the coming weeks, if it hasn't already happened, for the mine to continue operating.
Thank you, Ruairí, for this overview. Both Elias and Judith, they were there, actually, they were camping there. So it would be interesting now to hear from them, like, why were you there? And what led you to go there? And how did you perceive what was happening from that perspective? So maybe we'll start with Judith. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Yeah, first, I'm in quarantine. Right now I have COVID. It's very mild, but I will still need my notes at some point. So sorry for that in advance if I might be a bit slow. Why did I go there? Yeah, I was there several times over the years. I went there for social events. There was a festival, I think, in 2021, the Culture Without Coal Festival. And it was, for the climate movement, it has been building up to be a point of, connection, of workshops, getting together. And long before it grew to this, when the eviction came, to be this place of conflict. So it was a very peaceful situation in the years before, right? Relatively peaceful. And I was there for that time and fell in love with the place. I'm a climate activist in Berlin. So when I do activism, it feels more, it's an urban thing. We go to plenaries in the city, and then afterwards each goes home. And it's a bit isolated from the rest of our lives, maybe a little bit. And when you go to Lützerath, then it's everything. So all your basic needs, you fulfill there. You discuss everything. Everything is being discussed in plenaries, and it's more of a holistic feeling of being in that conflict that the climate crisis is. So I think that's why I always came back, and also came back for the eviction, where I stayed in Eckhard Heukamp's, who was already mentioned, in his old barn, where we barricaded us. But I think we're going to discuss that later, huh? Then I will maybe pass on to Elias.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Also, thank you to Bernardo for moderating, and also all of you for joining, and also Niklas for helping organize this session. I think it's really amazing. It may seem like a little bit late, since all of the things that we're talking about already happened in January, but for me, actually, it feels like just the right time, because it took a while to sort of process everything. I don't know if people are feeling the same, but I'm only increasingly coming to terms with what happened. So yeah, actually similar to Ruairí and Judith, I'd also been in 2021 and had always wanted to go back at some point, and it so happened that my contract as a fellow in Potsdam actually ended in December, and then this call came, so it felt like a good time to go in January, after doing this research project for 8 months in Potsdam about climate activism, to get a little bit more into the hands-on side of things again, and to forget about, I guess, the more brain-heavy side of research for just a few weeks. And I think we've also talked about this with other comrades who've gone, that there was a side of it that felt very good being there. It felt like being in the right place. It felt like there was a community that formed that was that felt more like home than many of the other communities that we tend to live within. But there was, of course, also the incredible pain that I think for me became very visceral during the police operation. And I remember, because we actually didn't make it very far, we already got evicted on the very first day, and then the police sort of put us up in front of the fence and made us watch them building the fence that they built around the village on the first day of the eviction, and felt incredibly painful. Personally, but also thinking about what this means for the world and the climate and whatever. So there are mixed emotions, I would say, about what happened, and I'm still grappling with that. Yeah, many other thoughts, but I think we'll get to them.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a good place to start. One thing I think that would be helpful to us to understand the significance of what happened there is to understand the importance of that mind. So I don't know, maybe we could talk a little bit about that before we go back to the occupation itself. Like, economically, was it very important? Whose interests is it serving, and so on? Maybe we could, in your article, you dive into a little bit about that, and I think it would be good to understand a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, the Garzweiler is one of I think there's 2 or 3 large mines in the region.
3.
3, yes. And that's one of the 3 main lignite mining regions in Germany. And it's operated by RWE, which has kind of changed over the years, but was originally kind of founded in, I think, Essen. It was part of the Ruhr Valley coal boom in the late 19th century. And since around then, up until today, it's partly owned by the local communes or the local governments. I think it's currently at about 25% ownership is public, basically. It's very well integrated into the region, as that region has been dependent on coal, or not just coal extraction, but coal-heavy industries since the late 19th century, though increasingly less so. So it's been pretty integral to economic growth within the region. It's been a provider of jobs. It's been a provider of taxes and direct income through the ownership. So it's there's very much a coal lobby politically amongst the bigger parties there. The RWE is a big donor as well. So it's very politically and economically influential. And that, I think, has made it difficult to politically contest, why this mine should close. A lot of people consider, I remember speaking to one activist on my first time there, and he said, it's hard to speak to some people around here because we say RWE is destroying Lützerath, is destroying the environment, and they say, well, RWE built my school. So, it's so deeply ingrained there that it's quite difficult for a lot of people locally and politicians to contest it. But of course, coal is being phased out. The date keeps getting moved, but the agreement is that it will be phased out. So eventually, it will not have a future as a coal mine. And so to explain as well, specifically about lignite coal, is that it's not like hard coal, which is sold on global markets and moved here and there. Lignite is very cheap and it's very combustible, so it's not worth, or it's not very safe to transport or to store for very long. So basically, it's burnt on site. So the 2 major power plants nearby are what feeds it, and those are some of the most polluting power plants in Europe. So this is it's a lot of carbon we're talking about. It's not a small amount.
Is it more for industrial use or
it's largely power generation, I believe. Most of it.
So it goes to the grid.
A lot of it goes to the grid, yeah.
Okay.
So it's also, yeah, as well as economically, is important for power generation locally. But RWE is also multinational. It's active in several continents, I think, through subsidiaries, and it is slowly turning into a renewable energy company. I think they claim to be net zero or carbon zero or something by 2040 or 50. I can't remember what they say, but they have a plan of some sort, and you do see around the very flat plains around the mine, you see a lot of windmills. So they are obviously making that transition. They are not making it very quickly, and they want to make it on their own terms. But RWE was effectively founded in, I think, the 1880s or so on, and it does plan to exist past the fossil fuel era.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if Judith and Elias, who were involved there, how does this inform the activists in terms of the actions and strategy on the ground? In particular, how grounded the company is in the community. So I suppose it makes very hard, and also it epitomizes a lot of the challenges of the climate movement more broadly. This contradiction between the jobs and economic benefits and the long-term sustainability and so on. So yeah, I wonder how does all this inform you and your peers there on the ground?
Okay, then maybe I start again. Okay. So yeah, I suppose so. Yes. The company has a lot of relevance in the region, but there's also, of course, resistance. The expropriation of land, for example, is really an issue that people have been fighting against long before the occupation started. The family of Eckhard Heukamp has been expropriated for the second time now with this eviction of Lützerath, and that is something, yeah, that people, like local neighborhood initiatives, have been organizing against for a decade and longer. And I think this combination that we saw now in Lützerath, the combination of local resistance, of middle-class people and young activists, and also radical activists, that these groups learned to work together, was really, that was the strength of the occupation in the end, because they respected each other, and they had a diversity of tactics. So they had very low threshold events, also Christian events. They had a Christian initiative called Kirche im Dorf lassen, protesting against the tearing down of the very old church in the neighboring village, Immerath. And at the same time, of course, this rather radical tactics. And yeah, there was this working together and coming together that impressed me a lot. So yeah, but I think I also have limited view on this. This would be also interesting to discuss more in depth with people who did the local networking there. And I can only, in this case, speak as a visitor. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's it from my side.
Yeah, I think these are good points. I would just add a few things. I think what RWE epitomizes to me is the power of fossil capital, or the power that fossil capital still holds within German society. And I think this is also why it's become such a big symbol. I mean, the last big wave of climate mobilizations pre-pandemic, we remember, were of course the big mobilizations in 2019, where we had the large climate strikes, but also large actions by Extinction Rebellion. And I think the largest Ende Gelände action in history. And in that year, we also had the so-called coal compromise, which was basically a middle finger to the climate movement, politically speaking. It was a law that was just scientifically completely unjustifiable and showed the power that, the coal industry still holds in German society. And of course, RWE is the epitome of that. And people ask how these things work. And of course, there's a lot of reasons, but I just want to highlight that also RWE has thousands of politicians on their payroll locally, but nationally, they have poured millions of euros into disinformation and greenwashing campaigns. So they hold this incredible power. And I think the climate movement sort of, I guess, during the pandemic also had a little bit of a reflection process in realizing that you can't only rein in this power simply by appealing to the consciousness of enlightened politicians, because often they're also constrained by this very real power that RWE wields. That's one thing. And then the other thing I think that Ruairí has already mentioned a little bit, which makes it much harder to deal with RWE. RWE is not just fossil capital, it is also increasingly at the same time green capital. They're basically buying, just like other fossil fuel companies, they're buying all the other big actors within the renewable energy sector. And so they're playing this game where they like to highlight that they're also the driver of the energy transition, but by literally buying everyone else, of course, they can also determine the speed of that energy transition. And so I guess we are getting to the point where fossil capital increasingly becomes green capital. They're one of the same thing, and that's not necessarily good thing, I would say. So analytically speaking, that's I think, interesting, but it makes it, of course, so important to confront these companies directly. And I think the movement did that very well, and to point out precisely where the state power and private capital merge, and to point at these deals that are being made and that were being made behind doors, but also in public between RWE and the ministry about how to exactly go about these the coal exit, and to point exactly where this power lies and to try to fight it, as much as possible.
And if I could just add to that, and another kind of overlap of the state and private concerns is in the mining legislation. The reason the RWE can expropriate farmers or other landowners is because of mining laws that go back to, I think, the 30s, and have basically, with specific, I think particularly with anything to do with energy, so coal, it gives wide prerogatives to basically expropriate anyone who doesn't want to sell their lands to the energy company or the mining company. So there's some cases where there might be a protected area or so on, but basically it's very difficult to resist that, and that is what happened with Hooikamp, is that he mounted the legal defense, but ultimately still, just as decades ago, still today, if the fossil fuel company wants your lands to mine coal, it's very hard to prevent that.
This brings me to another question that I had, which is the relationship between the political parties, and in particular the Green Party, which was involved in as member of the government of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, and also at the federal level with the company. And so I was wondering, especially the two of you who were there on the ground, but also Ruairí, who has been following for a couple of years now, how has this been perceived by the activists, and also what does that mean in terms of the prospects of a German climate policy when you have like the Green Party engaging in this way with an energy company? What are the political implications of that? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe you can go.
Sure. I mean, sure. It's worth just describing the kind of the deal that was made between the German government that was brokered by the Green Party specifically and RWE. So in March, the court decision was that Heukamp would be evicted. And then I think September, October, the government announced that they had struck a deal with RWE. It was kind of a surprise. It's kind of a backroom thing, brokered by Robert Habeck, the Green Energy Minister, and locally Mona Neubar, who is a local minister in North Rhine-Westphalia. And they basically got a few concessions that Lützerath was to be demolished, but several other adjacent villages would be preserved. The coal exit date for the region would be brought forward from 2038 to 2030. And they say this would keep 280 million tons of carbon in the ground, I believe. And so they, and part of the justification for this was the need for coal to still be used because of the Ukraine war and the lack of Russian gas and so on. So this was presented by the Greens in the press conference. Immediately, any climate groups or activists basically rubbished the deal and said it wasn't a good one, and that, you know, by 2030, carbon taxing should probably price out coal anyway. So it's debatable whether it's really moved anything forward at all. And also, you know, to Lützerath had already, as the other speakers have said, has become like a quite iconic and quite like a place of great importance to the climate movement in Germany, to especially, you know, people who are involved in green politics, many younger green voters and activists themselves. So to basically say, as I think Habeck did, that it was the wrong symbol and that it should be given up was not taken well. And that's caused, I think maybe these the other two speakers can speak more on this, but it seems to have certainly caused a major cleft between activists on the ground in Lützerath and the Green Party. When I first visited in 2021, just before the elections, I was actually kind of surprised at how many people said they would vote for the Greens, or, you know, they were skeptical, but they would say, oh, well, at least to have them in government is certainly better than the CDU. Whereas when I went in January during the eviction, there was very little of that talk. There were a lot of chants against the Greens and so on, and no one seemed to be particularly sanguine about having them in government anymore.
Judith?
Yeah, I think particularly Mona Neubauer as a figure in North Rhine-Westphalia was really controversial, because she has been campaigning to save Lützerath alongside the activists before she became the energy or economic minister in North Rhine-Westphalia, to then be the one to not only make that deal, but also be a bit condescending to the activists to remain peaceful and to get it over with, basically. So the way she has shifted her position, I think, really caused a lot of outrage and loss of trust in the Greens. But I think even more so, I mean, the direct confrontation with the police then later. For the climate movement, this was the second time that the Greens initiated such a big police clearing of an area in Germany. It was the Dannenröder Wald in, I think, 2020. That was also a Green government that pushed for this in Hesse, and now again in North Rhine-Westphalia. And this connection to see this direct state violence, to be subject to the state violence, and also with the Green government, I think is particularly yeah, traumatic for especially younger activists.
Elias?
Yes, and I mean, it's traumatic because it's confronted the movement quite viscerally with the failure of its own electoral strategy. I mean, there were large sections of the climate movement in Germany, but I think this applies to other contexts as well, had in the past few years sort of put their hopes in a kind of electoralist strategy where they would try to politicize local and national elections and even European elections, and sort of make fact sheets about which parties are most sustainable than other parties. And a lot of the recent climate strikes have been organized around election dates, in the hopes, of course, that you could nudge a greater part of the population to vote for more green parties. But of course, I think we increasingly are confronted with the reality that there are limits to the strategy, and that, of course, green parties in government are also subject to the same sort of systemic constraints that other parties are, and the kind of power structures that we've talked about. And so, and I think there was in the movement, the sort of more critical sections were a bit concerned that the Green Party and this rhetoric of Green Party government and this rhetoric of ecological modernization that's being used by the current government could sort of demobilize the climate movement, and that certainly hasn't happened. And I think that's a good thing, that despite having the Green Party in government, the climate movement isn't fooled so easily. And the demonstration in Lützerath was massive, considering that it was announced only 12 days before the demonstration, and that, I mean, Lützerath is not the most accessible place in Germany, and I think you had up to 40,000 participants in that demonstration in the middle of the countryside. I mean, 40,000 people is, you may get that easily in Berlin when you have someone really famous coming, but in the middle of nowhere, where the movement had only 10 days to organize buses and trains and whatever, that really shows the organizational strength that the movement still has. And yeah, and I think the momentum is still there, too, that we may see more actions in the summer.
Interesting. Still staying on this issue of the protest. Maybe, Elias, you could tell us a little bit more about the as Ruairí pointed out, the Lützerath was called the wrong symbol. How do you see this from your analysis of this protest? And is it the wrong symbol? Is it was Lützerath just a symbolic thing? How does this fit into the broader climate movement in Germany? So I don't know. How do you feel that for the activists who were there, the meaning of the protest and the occupation was?
Right. I'd be curious to hear what other people in the room have to say about this as well. But I mean, personally, I think the only people who said there was the wrong symbol were sort of politicians in power who were annoyed by the protests. And I think that rather shows that they're actually sort of, this is the right lever to pull, or the right point to criticize, because it precisely shows the hypocrisy of the government. And it also, I mean, it is very real. I mean, you can argue about the exact amounts of coal that are buried beneath Lützerath, but it is so significant that it endangers, that if we burn all of this coal, it very clearly would put the German carbon economy beyond its allowed contribution towards achieving the 1.5 goal in Paris. I mean, in that sense, it is not a symbol. It's a very real struggle. It's also a struggle that is the reiteration of like hundreds of years of struggle of against the enclosure of the commons for private profit. I mean, the pictures that you had of Lützerath, where it was enclosed with this fence and so on, were like, felt like a very real reiteration of a process that's been unfolding for hundreds of years. In that sense, I don't think it's a symbol. It's something very real. But yeah, I don't know what you think about it, or also, I don't know, other people.
Judith, do you have anything to add?
Nothing much. I totally agree. I would just maybe add that not only, I mean, Lützerath itself was not a symbol at all, but also the violence that we experienced was very, very real. I mean, it was very concerning, especially at the demonstration, how the police acted. And yeah, many people took home bruises and broken bones, actually. And that is, yeah, you can only call this a symbol when something like that happens, when you're not there, when you're very, very far away. But when you're there, you really understand that yeah, this is the climate conflict that we are in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You don't really mobilize 1,000 police officers to protect a symbol. And that was, it definitely was speaking to protesters there during the week. That line they kept repeating that particularly after Habak, it seemed to really, really bother people. And I do think that, especially in that location, like it is, as this week was saying, really it is very visceral, like, because you see the whole like carbon extraction, and like because of lignite being extracted there, burnt there, the electricity being generated, you see all of this stuff that is sometimes quite abstract. You know, a combustion engine in a car is quite abstract as how you connect this to climate change or to extractivism in the Middle East or whatever. But this is all happening right on site. You can see the whole process. So it's to call it symbolic is not really. Yeah, it is quite bizarre, really, I think.
Interesting. No, thank you. I think now I would like to put the Lützerath into also this context of German climate policy. Just last night, the German government made some announcement that in practice weakens the climate policy by eliminating carbon reduction goals of each ministry, and now it's like the government as a whole. And also the federal government also has announced that it will be prioritizing the construction of highways. Building highway is now, and I quote, of outstanding public interest. So I see a pattern there, not a good pattern, but there's a pattern, you know, of Lützerath and this is with in the context of the Green Party being a strong party. You also have, and being in government, you also have the climate strike movement, maybe, you know, the climate movement at its height, and yet all this is happening. How do you, Judith and Elias, see this, and what does this mean? Has the German climate movement failed? If they are this powerful, they have a supposed ally in government, and yet what is German climate policy? So I put that question to you. Yeah.
Judith, do you want to go, or? Okay, my internet is, let me know if I'm freezing. I think what the current or the latest reiteration of the latest compromise within the traffic light coalition in Germany represents, I think, is actually not a novelty. It's it is what you get when you have different sections of capital agreeing to a compromise in the name of ecological modernization. And what you usually get is that the more backward sections of capital get what they want. For instance, coal mine extension, further highway extensions, and
growth.
Within the paradigm of growth. It also, of course, satisfies, so people who care, you consider ecological and social concerns. But in that sense, it's actually.
I think we lost him. Yeah. I don't know, do you have anything to add? Maybe Elias will come back.
Yeah, I hope I'm not repeating anything said, but yeah, it's I guess particularly as a journalist who writes in the English language in the Anglophone press, is typically a way of describing the Green Party in shorthand terms is to reference their outgrowth of the radical climate movement. And I think maybe I've been guilty of doing this, but it was some time ago. They don't seem to have much to do with it these days, and so I think Lützerath is a quite clear example of that. Is the maybe previous generations of the Greens had some roots in the climate, the more radical climate movements, but the current leadership of the Greens do not, and they do not have particular interests in dealing with them, I think. And the Green Party appeals to a wider voter base than people who just care about radical climate change, climate protection, or climate protection at all, perhaps. So it's not clear that the compromises there, it's not clear that they have the same interests, which is, I think, what Elias was saying, as the people on the ground. So you can expect the compromises that they make to be compromises that are not necessarily in line with what climate activists would like to see happen.
Yeah, and then one last point I would like to bring up before we open for questions from the audience is our role as Judith, as a researcher, as an academic, and then also as an activist. And how do you see that? Is there a contradiction there, or on the contrary, do you see this your climate activism as almost like a moral obligation because of what you know is wrong and needs to be done? How do you how do you deal with this apparent contradiction?
Yeah, I think many people see a contradiction there, and I think there might have been good reasons to be very careful bringing activism and being a researcher together. But I think that time that ship may have sailed already. So maybe 50 years ago, this approach, speaking truth to power, was the right idea. So to try to remain from the political discourse and to really just state the facts and not get involved. But 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe we should have at some point shifted that relationship and reconsidered our role as scientists. And this is happening more and more now, and I'm happy to see it. On the one side, the IPCC includes activism as a relevant factor for transformation. And on the other hand, we see many scientists stand up and engage in acts of civil disobedience. So they lead by example, and I think are trailblazers for more scientists to engage in civil disobedience. And that's what I personally hope for, because when we look at the science, we see that civil disobedience and protest is a great factor for change. I also want to quote here the political scientist Oskar Berglund, who is a co-author of a paper called Civil Disobedience by Scientists Helps Press for Urgent Climate Action that was released in Nature, in comment section, so in the Nature journal. He says, we have a kind of what we call epistemic authority here. People listen to what we are saying as scientists, and it becomes a way of showing how serious the situation is, that we see ourselves forced to go deep to these lengths. So yeah, to point to the solution by leading by example, to engage in these acts of activism or even civil disobedience, I think really is now within the responsibility of researchers.
Thank you. I think there is also a similar debate regarding journalism and activism. You know, well, is there? How do you yourself? How do you see this issue?
I mean, well, from my perspective, I wouldn't consider myself an activist journalist, partially because as a freelancer, I think that's it's easier to hedge your bets and not do that, basically, and sometimes lean into writing that's more maybe activistic and sometimes not, gives you options of doing both. So that would just be my personal opinion. I know many people who do activist journalism. I know many people who don't do any of it. And I would say the economics of the industry would tend you away from it because the places that publish it are relatively few and far between. So it's particularly as a freelancer, I would say it can be quite tough to do as a full-time job. So that would be my main thoughts about.
But also in a way, because there is also the counter-activism, right? That you just that is not considered to be activism, but it is in a way, but for the status quo, so it doesn't count as activism.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you could definitely say that people who write for the Springer publications are activists in addition to being journalists. And likewise, I think that the phrase epistemic authority is interesting because if, you know, scientists don't intervene as activists, people who work for think tanks who are funded by the fossil fuel industry will be happy to take up that position and argue from their authority. So yeah, it's someone has to do it, basically. Yeah, I think it's very good to see, and I think the public definitely like to see scientists you know, out of protests and so on. For journalists, I definitely think there's a place, there should be more places for activist journalism, but it is tough, I think, to do that and to maintain it. But yeah, you're right that there's certainly a status quo activism, but it's a lot more common.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you all. I would like now to open it to our audience. If someone has any questions that would like to pose to either of our Elias is back. I don't know, and if you, before we open, if you want to conclude your thought that you were in the middle of when you froze, or if we can just move on.
I think Ruairí did an excellent job at following up, and just curious about what people think.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So yeah, either online, if you have questions, just raise your virtual hands, or here as well, if anyone has any question. Nicholas, do we have questions from the?
Not yet, no. I have a small question on something that you, Rory, pointed out before about this interesting aspect of the whole cycle of extraction and production and the economic, say, benefits and fallout happening in the same place, which is that often you hear this narrative of like extraction in the south and let's say consumption in the north of the world, respectively, and it's kind of used as a framework to also understand like what should be the options or the strategies of climate activists, both in the south and the north. But in this case, kind of goes against this narrative. So are there conclusions? Can we like learn something from this? Is maybe the south versus north kind of paradigm not so important after all. Maybe it's like the presence of, or the whole cycle of like a company who has been dominating a place for a long time more important than like other considerations. Maybe, you know, as you were saying, the extraction happened in a different place, or it's a more indirect cycle, so I won't see it. Like in this case, I see it very directly. So it's a very open-ended question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's I mean, the north-south divide is still present. One thing that it was very clear when you visited the camp, there was a lot of banners, a lot of graffiti referencing the global south, the Niger Delta, or the Kurdish groups, or all sorts of stuff. There's very much very clear that, you know, extractivism here is going to primarily affect the more climate vulnerable regions in the global south. So there's still that element, but I think I guess my point was that it was just interesting to see, you know, coal is not the only fuel in Germany, obviously, and a lot of it does come from the global south, so that is still true. But it's, when people are talking about symbols and levels of abstraction, it is often quite abstract to think of these things, but this was just certainly a case where it wasn't abstract at all. You could in the same line of sight, you can see where the coal is extracted, where you can see a huge conveyor belt sending it off towards the power factories, and then you can see the town in the distance, and the cable lines. You can see it all there in front of you. So that's obviously not the case in most places, but it was very instructive to be able to see that there.
There's a question from the chat. But does Elias or Judith want to address this as well? Or
yeah, maybe briefly. For me, knowing that I'm somewhat affected by the climate crisis, of course, living in a global north country, being in my 30s, I'm definitely not the most affected, but I will feel very severe impacts in many ways. Knowing that, but knowing it on an abstract level is really something completely different than experiencing, for example, the police beating you for fossil fuel interests. So I think it helps to understand really how real this is. And this is, of course, the precondition for real solidarity with people in the global south. So to make that also more real. And I think this again is the big question of how successful we are going to be in this struggle. How much we are able to incorporate global solidarity in all that we do.
Elias, you want to add anything?
Just one sentence. I think the movement in Lützerath did an excellent job in connecting with struggles in Mexico, Kurdistan. This has been mentioned. They have invited
Okay, we lost Elias again. Maybe if you cut your feet.
maybe more better audible than they have themselves traveled. Oops, I am so sorry about my internet connection. Just to say that these international connections help to highlight, of course, the hypocrisy of the German government internationally.
Okay. It's a pity that I think the question that we have here in the chat is would be great for Elias. He's back. Maybe Elias is in Taiwan, and it's the internet there is almost as good as Berlin's internet. The question we have in the chat also, I think you would have something to say about that. The question is, was there okay, all right, would you like to address Rory, that question in the chat?
I mean, maybe Judith would have more insight on that one than I would.
Judith?
Unfortunately, I don't. I'm not aware.
So yeah, Elias, he has been watching this issue, precisely the connection between the climate movement and the labor movement, and so we'll see what he'll write. Do we have any other question from the audience? Okay. I can see your name because it's covered by. But you're on mute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Pardon my pronunciation, but I'm curious around how the German media treated the destruction of Lützerath and the activism counter to it, and if whether the media coverage of it matched up with the general public perception of what happened.
I mean, I think it's split along lines that were not really surprising to anyone who'd read any of the given news outlets. I think the conservative media were obviously opposed and portrayed the people involved as very naive or not understanding, or too radical. And there were some more left-wing publications that were quite sympathetic. So it more or less went along the lines of any other climate protest that happens in Germany. I think there's quite fixed sides at this point. But there was a very strong online presence from the activists there. I mean, just the amount of traction it got on social media was more or less on the terms of the activists because they were doing it themselves. So that was quite an impressive, from my perspective, quite an impressive organization, the social media organization and the media that they were putting out, which was very much broadcast by international broadcasters, kind of on the terms that they would like. So I think that was a good example of how you try and push the media to your side.
Do Elias or Judith have anything to add to this question? Elias, no? Okay. Elias, maybe you can try to answer the question that you wrote down. If it doesn't work, we read it out loud. Let's give it a try.
The question was about connection with workers, right?
Yeah. Oh.
So I gathered, I mean, I asked a lot of people about this, that it was very hard to connect with the workers that work in the coal industry directly because they're organized in IG mostly, which is a very regressive union and has actively campaigning against environmental activists for a long time. I'm not sure if there were any like individual connections, that may well be, but there were definitely these arrangements with some of the security guards. And I gather that this played a role in the lead up to the eviction, where it was easier for activists to occupy some of the houses in Lützerath that had still been held by RWE, and that there was a lot of security guards who didn't necessarily do their best to defend those houses because they themselves were sometimes sympathizing with the cause. Of course, some of them were also very much sympathizing with RWE, but there was definitely no homogenous sort of working class position there. And of course, in the broader context, I mean, there was in North Rhine-Westphalia a lot of connections with I mean, some of the same people that were in Lützerath were also involved with organizing around the strikes that happened in hospitals last year, where they were helping to organize healthcare workers. And I think with the RWE expropriation campaign, RWE and Eignen, we may hope to see more of these connections in the future. And yeah, I'd be curious if anyone here knows more about this, but I hope this is something that'll become more important as we learn how to fight these big corporations.
Thank you, Elias. We have a question from Regina Ruairí.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this meeting. I'm Regina, I'm from Argentina, and I've been looking quite closely to the Lützerath case, very I have colleagues that are activists and have been participating there. And I was wondering if you could give me, I'm curious, if you could give me some insights on your internal discussions also on the alternatives to the phasing out of coal. And because nowadays in Argentina, we're having these huge discussions on the lithium extraction, and this comes together with the energy transition, right? So if we think of phasing out of coal, then this, this brings up the whole idea, or this motorizes this whole idea of the energy transition, and this can also bring, displacements, extractivisms, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if you did have these discussions also within the different movements, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Judith, God bless you. Would you like to take that question?
I can say something. So I think in broad parts of the movement, there's a consensus around the degrowth idea. So that we in general have to also cut on especially luxury consumption and lifestyles in order to also reduce the resource throughput that is, of course, related to the extraction that we see all around the globe, and especially in the global south. Yeah. So I think that's all I can add to this.
Elias?
Yes. Just because this also previously came up, I think we already had a coal exit in Germany, which was the Steinkohle exit. Only meant that local coal extraction was stopped, but the plants that are combusting Steinkohle are still running, and instead this coal is imported. I mean, until recently, a lot from Russia, but also Colombia and other countries where, where environmental conditions are and social conditions are perhaps even worse. And actually, in Lützerath, they also hosted a delegation from one of these regions in Colombia where that kind of coal is extracted. So I think this was definitely a conversation topic, and it's something we have to think also with the present coal exit.
Rory, do you have anything on that topic?
No.
Okay. Nicholas, we have a question there in the comments, in the chat. Okay, so it's about the role of social science in such a conflict. Because during the eviction, I observed the impact of all the reports regarding the needed amount of coal, numbers, models, etc., but perspectives of social sciences were very quiet. That was my impression. Judith, what do you think?
So social sciences can definitely help us figure out what societies need in order to change. We can look at history. History teaches us important lessons. And of course, there's also quite some problematics that we only have in the here and now. For example, a lot of misinformation around the socio-ecological transformation, doubt, emergence of doubt. So yeah, I see a lot of benefit in engaging more in social sciences in the climate crisis, because the institutions right now are failing us. So societies need to kind of step up and how does this work? How can we organize ourselves, and how do we build power is something that social science can help us with and inform us.
Okay. Elias, do you want to add anything? Can you add anything? Oh, maybe not.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, okay. Well, I think this is important. I think social scientists need to engage with movements, and social scientists know a lot about, or at least some of them have quite a lot of knowledge that movements really need. Like how historically change has been fought for, what kind of strategies have worked and not. These are, I mean, debates that are being held in the movement as well. That said, I also think it's important that social scientists do not like go into the movement and think that they have the solution. This is also something that happens. But of course, in general, I think we're still working on a broader societal understanding that sort of social sciences and humanities are equally important to addressing the climate crisis. And I mean, with the TV debates that we saw around Lützerath, again, this is the eternal thing that they, of course, invite natural scientists to then calculate like certain numbers and come to certain conclusion. But I mean, in 2023, we should really understand also as a society. I guess this goes also to media, and that, of course, the questions that we're grappling with are as much about power as they are about power generation. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah, maybe can I just add one sentence? In the global north, I think we see right now in these late capitalist societies a lot of resignation. And this resignation is a social phenomenon. It's not just individual. I lose all hope that we can mitigate this climate crisis. It is something cultural. It comes with a certain way how we perceive other people. What kind of image do we have of mankind, of itself? So capitalism has its own image of humanity, that every human is kind of greedy, seeks dominance, and is competitive. And we all have these ideas in our heads, and social science can help overcome this and make space maybe for a new image of ourselves, of humanity, that we need. Because if we don't have that, we cannot change collectively.
Thank you. Do you have any other question? Anyone here? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe one question. I think we talked a lot about kind of trust. On the one hand, on the level of trust towards the government, especially green parties who are supposed to be representatives of this movement, but also maybe trust in executive structures. Judith, you talked about police violence, and I would be interested how you perceive how the Lützerath events affected social cohesion and trust within the society towards governmental structures, because I felt like there is this injustice of this climate impact, but also this injustice of there were people fighting for saving our planet against people who try to represent our just legal system, and this felt like really a great injustice, and be interested how you perceive that.
Yeah, I think what is being tried always by the media and by politicians is to particularize the group, right? To outcast them as radicals, as chaotic people. That's what was said also this time, and we saw that also around the Humvee, that the people were really outcast. And then in the big demonstration in Humvee, it was 50,000 people, and now for Lützerath it was 35,000 people. Then we see again that the broader societal cohesion there is quite big actually, and that's always nice to see. So in my impression, this is always being tried, but not very successful. But I would also love to hear how others here in the room and virtually perceive that. What's your impression?
Rory, did you get a feel in your reporting about this issue of trust?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure everyone who was in Lützerath could testify that it got quite a broad selection of society. I definitely met a lot of people who had just come from Cologne or Düsseldorf for a day, for a week, for whatever time they had, and people who had not been particularly involved in climate activism before. So in that sense, it's a clear success in building trust between like the more radical wing of the climate movement in Germany and people who have maybe a passing interest or knowledge of climate issues. So it definitely seemed to be successful on that level. I think there will always be, you know, people with other interests who are going to support whether it's RWE or the CDU or the Green Party or the police or some combination of those. And I think there is always going to be some impasse where those people won't be convinced by anything that the climate movement does or doesn't do. But amongst the people who could be swayed, I think it's notable that compared to, let's say, some other more controversial protests, whether it's, you know, attacking paintings or people gluing themselves to roads, I think there was a lot more public support for Lützerath, even amongst I think polls of just the German public in general showed the majority would like it to stay, which may not manifest itself directly in supporting the climate movement in other ways or parties that would do anything about that, but it's definitely something, and it's something to build on, and it's something that that shows that what was done at Lützerath was, I think, a lot more effective and a lot more engaging and building of trust than a lot of other things that have a lot of other strategies that have been used.
Thanks, Rory. Elias, do you want to add anything to the question of social trust?
Yeah, maybe to segue into another question that was asked in the chat, which I think is a good follow-up. The question about climate terrorists.
Okay, so let me just, for people who are not seeing, there is a question about the quote-unquote climate terrorists, which was brought up by some conservative politicians and journalists. And the question is, do you observe such a violent radicalization of climate activism? And what are possible strategies to, again, shift the narrative focus on more constructive approaches to deal with climate change?
Right. And so I think this is a very interesting one because it is a trope that appeared in German media, especially last fall when you had the first backlash against the last generation protests. And ever since, it's become sort of almost like a trope in any sort of discussion about climate activism and so on. And of course, it bears any sort of factual evidence. It is psychologically interesting, I think, why it comes up, but just to sort of rehearse that, no, actually, empirically speaking, environmental activism and climate activism, if at all, has become a lot more peaceful in the last 20 years. I mean, some people may remember the debates in the late 90s and early 2000s about the Earth Liberation Front and other groups. There was a big ecotage movement at that time, so ecological sabotage, where, you know, in 2004 the FBI declared environmental activists the #1 enemy of the state. This was past 9/11. We have to remember that, and they built in the United States. They built detention centers where they could extrajudicially detain environmental activists and all of that. So there was a time when both the trope and sort of the actual activism were at a much advanced level. And even in Germany, you had these kinds of groups. So I think no, and even in the last 5 years, I mean, the protests around Hambacher Forst in many ways were much more radical than what we saw around Lützerath, where you had actual sabotage of police vehicles at a much larger scale than you saw in Lützerath. So it bears no factual evidence, but of course the trope exists, and there are different ways for the movement to deal with it. It seems that to some extent, the right-wing press is so autonomous from reality that it really shouldn't affect the movement's choices too much, because it seems that regardless of what the movement does, of course, to some extent, there's always going to be the specter of climate terrorism that will haunt the right-wing press. But there are different, I think there are still different opinions in the movement with how you should react to that rhetoric. I think there are some people who say that you should use this and turn it in a way such that you could discuss about also the police violence and systemic violence that is exercised by fossil fuel emissions. So there are people that say, okay, we should stay within the violence frame instead of use that positively. And there are, of course, other people who say that we shouldn't leave the agenda setting to the right, and we should completely sort of ignore these kinds of debates and set our own topics. I personally am still a bit torn as to what kind of approach I personally support, and yeah, probably others are too.
Judith, do you have anything to add? No. Rory?
Well, I don't know. It's just surprising how little climate terrorism there is, really. When you consider how the semi-regularity of terror in like this political terrorism in the 60s or 70s or 80s, and how little there is now, from not including the far right, obviously, but from more progressive movements. There just is, it basically isn't really any, and yeah, there certainly is. I think there will always be this this line, regardless of what happens empirically, that they're going too far, they're too extreme, whatever. Yeah, but it's I think the fascinating question is, given the stakes and what you could justify if you think the stakes are the existence of the world, or however you'd like to phrase it, or that there isn't really people taking extreme action. So I don't particularly have an insight into why that is, but I just find that kind of interesting, the kind of counterpoint.
Yeah, we're heading towards the end of today's lecture. I don't know, do we have any questions from the audience here or online? If not, maybe we could go on for the last final thoughts from our guests. So I don't know, Judith, we can begin with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed the discussion also, and very grateful to be part of it. Final thoughts. I think for me personally, I'm a bit more critical of the role of the state in the socio-ecological transformations. Yeah, I think the police, the encounters with the police really gave me a strong feeling of, okay, the state is right now really organizing to push business as usual, and is ready to hurt us all. Yeah, that's maybe my final word. Elias?
Yeah, those are good final words. I think, well, I don't know, this is almost like a trope also, but of course Lützerath isn't over yet. The coal is still in the ground, and I think if ever, this is the time where people who are scientists but also citizens and rebels and whatever else subjectivities they might identify with, yeah, it's almost an obligation, I think, morally, ethically speaking, to get organized in one or the other way and to contribute to the struggle. And I think, yeah, I mean, Lützerath is just one of many signposts that point us towards, you know, organizing an action. I had a quote written down that I just wanted to read out because I think it captures this very well. It's by an Indian historian, Vijay Prashad. He writes, "Correct ideas are never sufficient. They are not believed or enacted simply because they are right. They become the ideas of our time only when they are wielded by those who come to believe in our own power, who use it to struggle through the institutions and to consolidate that power." So yeah, we can have the best ideas. They're worth nothing if we don't organize and help build power behind those ideas.
Thank you, Elias. Rory?
Yeah, I guess it will be interesting to see what becomes of the organizing that was done there and the kind of new faces and new parts of society that got involved in the climate movement due to Lützerath. It's also, yeah, it kind of, I'll be interested to see what kind of avenues the climate movement takes forward and what lessons they learn from it, whether they think dealing with the major political parties is a dead end, or whether they think, you know, policing is now one of the major obstacles to their ends, or I have no idea, but it does seem like it will be remembered as, you know, not to say it's a symbol, but it will be something important that the climate movement draws on in years to come.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Elias. Thank you, Judith, and thank you everyone who joined us both here in person and also online. And also I would like to thank in particular the people who joined us through the worldwide teaching on climate and justice. And I invite all of you to Google and find their website, and you can find other events like this one across the world. So it's really interesting, and it's taking place all throughout the week. And also, if you have your own event, you can also register there. And also, I'd like to invite everyone to our next lecture next month. It will be on April 24th at 3 p.m. and it will be again both online and also in person here at the RIFS premises in Potsdam, and it will be with Ulrich Brandt on a critical discussion of the justice term in face of the crossing of planetary and societal boundaries. So please look up on our website for information on past and future lectures and subscribe to our newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter at Justice RIFS, RIFS. So thank you everyone, and yeah, have a great week.